On tonight's show, we explore the current state of racism in Australia and unpack the damaging impact it is having within society. We'll expose the role of the media in driving online racism, as well as the detrimental mental health effects racism is having on its victims. We'll also uncover the current impact racism is having on the sporting field, and we ask you, the public, what you think racism looks like in your communities. That's all coming up on Resisting Racism Australia. Hello, I'm Ruby Quilligan. Thanks for joining us on Resisting Racism. Joining me today is Dr. Yassir Morsi, Yasemin Yaman, and Dr. Andre Oboler. Today's focus is on racism. However, to understand how to tackle the issue, we need to understand the different types of racism. I searched our campus for the answers. Racism. The belief in the superiority of one race over another and that all members of each race possess the same qualities and characteristics. People often associate racism with acts of abuse or harassment, but there is more than one type of racism. Dr. Yassir Morsi, a researcher of racism and politics at Latrobe University in the Gender and Diversity Department, explains the differences between what he calls capital R racism and lowercase r racism.
Capital R racism is kind of like the historical, institutional, economic and political racism. The small r racism is the one that we try to over-police, and that is people's attitudes, their cognitive thinking about others. What's changed is the kind of civil politeness of the way we talk about one another.
A more widely known term of lowercase r racism is called casual racism. So what is casual racism? Do you know? Does anyone know? Should we go and ask and find out? All right, let's ask some people. What do you think casual racism is?
Racism that's like put out there casually, without really thinking about it, and it's sort of like it's accepted in society when really it shouldn't be.
If you see someone driving bad, you say, oh, everyone from that country drives bad. It's a very bad trait people have. We all need to work on that.
Judging people on the basis of their nationalities and their cultures, maybe.
People are saying like borderline racist things just like off the top of their head, not really thinking it's anything a bit funny or something like that.
Hi, do you know what casual racism is?
No.
No.
Do you know what casual racism is?
No. Actually, I don't know.
Do you know what casual racism is? Does anyone know what casual racism is? The Australian Human Rights Commission defines casual racism as the offhand remark or throwaway line that relies on negative stereotypes about a person's race.
So often it's understood as the let-in slips of racism, where it just comes out, or that the person doing the casual racism is unaware of the harm and damage that their statements may make.
Understanding casual racism is important, as educating ourselves and the people around us is the first step towards a more aware and accepting Australia.
And every now and then in less thinking moments, when your guard's not up, you can let slip something that you have inherited as a belief system, assumptions that you have that most of the time you're trying to police. We talk about racism a lot without talking about it.
When you hear someone make a racist or act in a way that might make someone feel less of a person, speak up. Yassir, you're a part of this story. Could you elaborate?
So there has to be some distinction made, I think, between the everyday conversation about racism, which is generally reduced to stereotypes, generalizations, negative attitudes, which are harmful. I don't want to dismiss these things. They're definitely part of racism. And that's what we put in the category of small r racism, to distinguish between the historical realities, material, economic, political realities, policies such as White Australia policy go all the way back to the colonial settlement of Australia, which were kind of like the architecture and the foundations upon which racism established itself.
So what would be the danger of not addressing the capital R racism?
The sharp end of racism, its violence, comes through the discrepancy of wealth, security, life expectancy, material distribution, debates around reparation, the consequences of displacement, slavery. I mean, these are the sharp ends of it. So they have to be. They've created boundaries, borders, types of differences that cannot be overcome by just appeals to respect.
So Andre, do you think this happens mostly in real life, or do you think this happens online as well?
So my focus really is in the online environment, and I think it's a little bit different online. And the reasoning is because the online world is made up of speech. It's made up of the comments people post, the images they post, the memes that are shared. And because of this, the physical, if you like, virtual physical environment is those words. So normally those words would be what we've just discussed as small r racism, but online they can become the capital R racism because they actually build and define the infrastructure in which people live.
Our next story focuses on the impact racism can have on an individual's mental health. Brianna Borg has more.
Racism has been a global issue for many years. As a multicultural society, Australia has had its issues in regards to discriminating against someone for their race. Arthur Stukas, a professor at Latrobe University, specialises in social psychology and exposes what impact racism can have on an individual's mental health.
I looked at a meta-analysis of about 300 studies. So a meta-analysis is a cumulative look across the scientific literature, adding up the effects in all those different studies. And it looks like depression, post-traumatic stress, even suicidal ideation is associated with the experience of racism. Right, so reporting that you've been treated negatively on the basis of your race is associated with all these negative mental health outcomes.
He also shares what coping mechanisms there are that could be useful to someone being affected by racism.
It can't undo the entire effects of especially systemic racism, where the society is set up in a way that disadvantages people, right? That's hard to undo, but hopefully we can. But if you identify strongly with your in-group, so if you're a member of a racial minority, the stronger your sense of belonging and sort of, they call it ethnic racial identification, the more you feel like my group is important, I value the culture of my group, I learn the traditions of my group, then the smaller the effect of racism on your well-being and mental health.
Christy has experienced this type of discrimination firsthand. As someone with a Filipino background living in Australia, she has had racist slurs thrown her way for as long as she can remember.
When I was in high school, I would get it almost every day. There'd be instances even my teachers were racist to me. So it was really hard, and then I'd get out of high school and there'll be some random on the bus that would tell me that they hate me just because I'm Asian. So I copped it every single day.
Now, an adult working as a social worker in Frankston, she still feels the negative effects of racism.
There were people that would outright just say that they want someone like me out when I went to primary school here and I went to high school here, and I work here, I work in community services, and yet that just because of the color of my skin, it's just really hard and I don't want to cry.
Right, so if we're mindful, if we think more carefully about how we act towards others, perhaps then, we can lessen that impact of racism.
Sticks and stones can break our bones, but words can be even more harmful. How can we help minorities feel a sense of belonging?
So it's important for us to listen to minorities and see what they're already doing, see what kind of truths they're building for themselves that are grounded in their experiences. We have to resist, and I'm not saying this always occurs, but the kind of paternalism that often comes with anti-racism, that they're in need of help. I think the engagement has to be a bit more balanced in the sense we have to self-reflect about our positionalities and listen.
So Yasemin, here on campus, do you feel there's a lot of people engaged in these kind of communities?
Well, I'm secretary of the Islamic Society here, and I feel as though we run a lot of events that are particularly designed to involve not just the Muslim community, but like the wider community at Latrobe. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, it feels as though unless we have something to offer, there really isn't that much of an interest in interacting with specifically religious groups. Mm-hmm. And it's harmful because if we sit here and have these conversations by ourselves, we just create echo chambers of the same ideas, and we bounce these ideas that we've had for generations that are evolving but stay within our community because we're not going out and interacting with everyone else, and no one else really wants to come. I mean, there are always some people, but I just think we could do more as a society, like as the student body here at Latrobe, to create more interfaith events in which we all participate in productive conversations.
Although I appreciate all of these initiatives, I tend to have a different type of anti-racism. This is not a direct criticism of anything that's been said, but this is all grounded on what we call contact theory. And so you bring groups together and stereotypes and differences dissolve because we come to understand that. But, you know, again, this is focused on small r racism's recognition that counts as misrecognition. But the reality is racism also built on powerful hierarchical differences. And I think burdening a minority to go out there and show their humanity and their humanism, especially when those minorities do carry political traumas, do carry violences that they're dealing with. It's, you know, it's not a case of just being good. Racism shouldn't impact anyone irrespective of what I am, whether you see my humanity, you don't see my humanity, whether I have good food, bad food, whether I'm a good person, bad person. Racism isn't a rational, it's an arbitrary form of violence that will punish you for your difference. So when we have to continually show our sameness, that's part of the same logic. The way I see anti-racism isn't inevitably us getting along together and figuring out what's similar or what we share. It's precisely my ability to have differences with you, to debate and argue with you, to put forward my traumas and my politics that critiques and criticizes you without a systematic punishment coming and being returned. That's what I find difficult. Now, I'm not saying these initiatives aren't important, but sometimes these initiatives inevitably cover the ability for me to be a critic, for me to show anger, to show trauma, and I have to perform a good Muslim. I have to perform the idea that I too am Australian and all that. And you know what, I'll be honest with you, I don't feel like doing that most of the time.
Our next story explores racism in Australian sport and what is being done to educate the public. Alana Mullen has more.
It's back in the race. This is his natural habitat compared to Jolly.
It's a 50-metre penalty. Not sure what's happened there. Is Adam just had a word to somebody in the crowd, do you think?
He definitely went back and pointed at someone in the crowd.
Conversations surrounding racism in sport have recently been sparked after the viewing of the Adam Goodes documentary, The Final Quarter. The story explores the racial discrimination and vilification Goodes suffered on field. While racism in the AFL has always been a major issue throughout history, certain steps have been taken to try and combat such an issue.
So historically, Australian rules football has suffered from a reputation of being quite a misogynistic and a monocultural type of sport. It's the sport with the biggest spectator attendance and media figures, and to its credit, the Australian Football League, or AFL, as the governing body for the sport, has taken concrete steps to try and get rid of some of those perceptions of the sport as being quite monocultural.
The AFL has taken several steps to try and combat racial discrimination, including the introduction of Indigenous and multicultural rounds. Such games now form key dates in the AFL calendar and have also been As the Melbourne Football Club's first female Indigenous player, Alicia Newman has been heavily involved in designing her team's Indigenous Guernseys, and it's something she holds very close to her heart.
Being involved in anything so significant is having the girls run out in something that you've had part in. We haven't won a game in it yet, so I'm hoping that now that I've fully designed it, maybe they might want to win a little bit more, but no, it's incredible.
The AFL has established several Indigenous and multicultural programs in recent times. Last weekend, the annual All Nations Camp and Kickstart program was held at Arden Street Oval in partnership with the North Melbourne Football Club. While not only bringing children of many backgrounds together through AFL, the camp activities also include teaching Indigenous cultural traditions.
The next game that we're going to be playing is a game called Ploga. Can everyone say Ploga? Alright, cool. So what does the future of racism in the AFL look like?
While Newman hopes Australians will continue to gain a better understanding of cultural acceptance, she says nothing will stop multicultural players from playing the game.
I think we've always been here. We're good at sport and especially good at footy. So I think, yeah, just because these certain situations have happened, it's not going to shy us away from the sport at all, or want us to kind of give up due to these certain situations.
Alana Mullen reporting.
Teach them early and teach them not to be racist. How do we start the conversations about racial issues with kids?
I think it's a very difficult conversation to have with children because you're teaching them from a young age that they're going to be targeted and vulnerable in wider society, and it's always a very difficult thing to tell a child who at that point might not understand the gravity of what you're telling them. It feels as though in light of this trend of, self-care, we tend to protect and shield ourselves from difficult conversations. Because of that, we're shielding ourselves from things that are very important to be talking about, like we're not building the resilience that we need and the empathy that we need because we're actively distancing ourselves away from what's difficult.
You have to find the balance between protecting them but also, making them ready for the world that they live in. I'm married to an East African and my kids will have to deal with being Muslim, being African. One day, I fear, and I don't think it's an unfounded fear, somebody will say something. Mm-hmm. Some teacher will stare the wrong way, and so you have to make them ready for it. We can't afford to be colourblind, and it goes back to the issue of creating safe spaces. Sure, it's easy to protect, but the world's a big place and can be very ugly. So it's a difficult conversation. As a father, I wrestle with this all the time, and I want them to be good people, good Muslims, and but I also know that the world's going to hit them on the chin, and I just have to figure out how to make them jump straight back up.
Yeah. So who do you think should be having these conversations? Is it parents? Is it schools?
It's got to be a holistic approach. You can't, there was a tendency for a while to say, oh, this is the school's problem. Schools need to deal with this. Schools have a role to play, but whatever the schools do is going to be worth naught if it isn't followed through at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I think there's a tendency for all of us, and I totally appreciate this, to make sure that we all take collective responsibility, but some people are more responsible than others, and that's the reality of it. And I'm not saying you're not saying that, but all of us get bullied, pushed around a little bit, but it's not so much, say, my children, to return back to the example, that they will be harassed in any way. They have to deal with the realities of the world that is also violent towards people who look like them, believe in the things they believe in, and people who come from that part of the world they come from. And that violence has nothing to do with the school. That violence has something to do with our politicians, has something to do with the economy. We're having safe conversations. The safest conversation is to say, let's get along. The hardest conversation is, how do you restructure an entire economic political system to make sure that Indigenous Australians don't continually find themselves at the bottom rung of so many social ladders, and then the only time we have conversations about them is when they're victimised. There has to be so much more.
I think we need to not also lose focus of the obligations within the communities to educate against racism, not only as victims but also as perpetrators. We've seen...
By communities, do you mean... Name your community.
Okay, so I'll take two examples there. We've seen the recent incident with two school children where there was a Muslim student that was abusing a Jewish child. I've also spoken at a number of Jewish conferences about problems with a minority in the Jewish community who have been promoting Islamophobia. Those are issues within communities that are themselves victims, but the communities and the people in there need to be able to address it internally, not always just focus outwards on the people that are attacking us.
Sure. Things like anti-Semitism and anti-blackness kind of precede a lot of what we're talking about. These are centuries-old forms of discrimination, and of course they have to be... education is a big thing, sure, and being aware, but I would still resist a little bit that it's an equal responsibility by all. I mean, in the example of speaking about the Jewish-Muslim relationship, to talk about, say, mainstream versus Indigenous, or mainstream versus Jewish, mainstream versus Muslim, I don't think it's at all fair to say that both sides have an equal obligation to make sure that they're not harming one another. I think the side that has the most capacity to live a normal life and ignore racism has a bigger responsibility.
On to our final story, a look into the role media plays in racism. Maddie Forsman reports.
There is a correlation between the number of people who are Muslim in a country and the number of terrorist attacks. Now,
these African gangs are getting away with murder, literally.
An incredible crime wave involving children of African refugees.
This kind of coverage negatively stereotypes particular races and religions in the media. According to the Human Rights Commission, as many as 1 in 5 Australians have experienced race hate speech. Andre Oboler is the founder of the Online Hate Prevention Institute that aims to identify and remove online racism and xenophobia.
One of the big things we do is monitoring social media in particular and other online sources. We have a tool called Fight Against Hate that allows the public to report things to us.
He says journalists need to be more mindful of the language used when reporting on issues irrelevant to race.
One of the things we see is just the descriptive language. So if someone commits, some sort of crime or they're appearing at court, sometimes the ethnic identity of the person or the religious identity would be mentioned. Most of the time, it's completely irrelevant to what's being discussed.
In 2018, reports of African gang activity in Melbourne flooded the media with politicians claiming people were too afraid to leave the house because of organised crime.
People are scared to go to restaurants at night time because they're followed home by these gangs, home invasions and cars are stolen, and we just need to call it for what it is. Of course it's African gang violence.
These reports have since been questioned with a study showing that Sudanese crime makes up for just 1% of all the crimes committed within Australia.
When mainstream media goes and specifically identifies something as coming from a particular community, it starts being used repeatedly, and for some of them it becomes part of a narrative across multiple articles that sends a negative representation about that community.
The issue worsens when news outlets share stories on social media inviting a sea of comments, often inciting hate speech. Although social media platforms have policies in place helping to prevent hate speech, they often have flaws. This allows contextual racism to slip through.
The hate speech that is most obvious, the main platforms at least are getting better at putting in place artificial intelligence that can remove the most obvious examples.
As individuals, we can help prevent the spread of online hate by reporting racism and hate speech online. For more information on how you can prevent racism online, visit ohpi.org.au or itstopswithme.humanrights.gov.au.
Stopping racism is ultimately in our hands. Andre, do you think the way a headline is phrased can create negative stereotypes?
Look, headlines are often written by editors. They're not written necessarily by the journalists that write the articles. And what we see is they can actually misrepresent the article. They can, try and pick something that's going to pull people in, which is not actually the key point of the story. So because of that, they can be inflammatory and they can create a higher degree of racism and concern within society because a lot of people don't read more than the headlines.
Do you think the language for receiving negative comments about specific groups?
It can certainly encourage it. What we also see is even just the lead-in in social media, for instance. You can have huge amounts of negative comments just on a promo. So the story hasn't even aired yet. Nobody has any information. They just know there is a story on this topic. And that can be enough to spark a huge backlash.
What does the media's impact have on our view of minorities, maybe Yassir?
Media plays a significant role, of course. Becomes a site for both, an easy site for people to get what they want out of the world, and what they want, confirmation bias and so forth. And, major stories can have impacts on how minorities walk to work that day, and some politicians or some events can, September 11 was a political event, but it was also a media event, which drastically changed the entire landscape of how I understood myself as an Australian. And there's a desire attached to a certain type of racial abuse. People want to abuse. They want to see themselves as superior, better, they're all guardian of the nation. So sometimes, media does play a role, but sometimes I think we have to also recognise that racism isn't a rational, irrational dynamic. It's that people are waiting to tell you why you're wrong for being.
Yasemin, do you find headlines can create a negative stereotype?
We've always kind of, like as Muslims, as Arabs, we've always been othered as this exotic, like homogenous, like group that doesn't have an identity apart from, you know, serving the white gaze. And I think that sentiment has developed into, the sentiment of othering is there still, but it's gone from being fetishized and exoticized to, well, they're a terrorist, and there's still this detachment and apathy. And I think that comes from, one, a lack of education within the journalists and editors that create that content, but also perhaps even a lack of Muslims and Arabs within, like, not like minority groups within that field. Because if there isn't anyone telling our stories, then the stories are there to be warped and manipulated by people who don't quite understand them.
There's a general problem, but a large part of the problem is actually just due to a very small number of individuals. And I won't name them. You may have named some people already in some of the clips. But if you take out the content that those people are producing, the level of racism, inflammatory headlines, etc., drops substantially. So there's certain people whose careers, to a certain extent, are based on promoting racism and hate, with, you know, division within the community.
But if I can just kind of be totally honest with you all, and I'm a little fatigued by all of this. I've been doing this for a while and living it my whole life. So sometimes I just want to say, quite frankly, I'm a bit tired from chasing this golden goose. And the golden goose is this idea that somehow society is capable of fixing itself. It's not. We're never going to get to a stage where everybody's educated about everybody else. We're never going to get to a stage where people in power don't want to maintain power. I think the focus should be on how to protect one another from each and everyone's ignorance, each and everyone's capacity to harm. I'm not interested in doing what I've been doing for so many years, and that's playing therapist to white anxieties, or educator to white ignorance, or telling stories about where I've come from so I can be celebrated, understood as Australian. I'm fatigued by that. And if others want to do it, I will celebrate and support them. But I think also there should be this opportunity for people to say, look, I'm not here to make Australia great again. I'm here to survive. I'm here to live. I'm here to prosper. And if those who want to do it, do it. But I don't think anti-racism should be continually built on these pillars of education, tolerance, because they will collapse. They should be built on security, and irrespective of what I am or what you know about me, whether you understand me or don't understand me, you have no right to punish or harm me. And that requires punitive punishments to those who do harm me, not education, not providing them material support so they can read a book about Islam. No, if you say something wrong on Twitter or on Facebook, you have to pay the punishment for that. I send them a cup of tea, Muslim Day, Open Mosque Day, stuff like that. That's a reward system. And I understand that. But at the same time, I really want to know, I want everybody to tell me, how are you going to protect my children and their generation from those who refuse to be educated? And that for me is a bigger question. And I will admit, and as a final comment, I say this from a complete position of fatigue. I am tired by hoping for a better public discourse. The minority that you mentioned, the few that create the problem, if we remove them, yeah, the world will be a better place. But guess what? They're always going to be there. They're never going to be removed.
So, again, one of the challenges I see is the power that comes with social media. It creates new power structures. The tech companies can play a real role in dampening the spread of hate, dampening the impact on people, again, because their platforms are where people are spending a huge percent of their life. So everything we can do to improve that environment, yes, it won't change the views of those people that want to promote racism, but at least let's take the racism out of the environment people are having to live in. or out of the environment where, you know, their birthday invites are going, where their friends are organising events, and people are saying, hey, I'm not going to participate in that platform because it's just too hostile to me and I don't need that headache, I'm fatigued with it.
Well, that concludes our broadcast for today. You would like to be treated. Have a good day.